Buenos dias. I apologize in advance. I don't speak Spanish or Catalonian. I speak a lot of English and some very poor French. So I'm glad and thank the translators, and I hope that they wave at me when I speak too fast, okay? So first of all, thanks for letting me join your community here today. It's not my first time in Barcelona, but it's my first time with you, for some of you. And I'm super passionate about community and open. And so I think we need to talk about what we mean when we say open. What are the responsibilities that we have? And what are the activities that we can do in order to make ourselves a bit more open? And not to have a midlife crisis around open, but I kind of am, so you guys get to hear about that. So more often than not in our communities, we're here among allies. All of us have been on this journey. We're obviously here on a Wednesday because you're super passionate about open government and open communities. Some people are passionate about open data or open source or open whatever you want to throw the sentence behind. I believe in open mapping, right? So we all say, yeah, we're open. We are open. But that's not enough anymore because we actually have a crisis of open. And that's kind of a sad thing to say because people are coming and going, leaders are burning out, new people are maybe not feeling welcome. So we need to think through how we build open together a little bit better. Maybe we need to move from being organic to being more purposeful. And that's a hard journey to take. So while we say we're open and we should be proud that we're working on open communities, we still got work. So in reflecting on open, 8 years ago in November, I was here in Barcelona for MozFest. And at that particular time, I worked at tech companies, and I wanted to know how I could combine my passion for open and technology with humanitarian action. So I made a decision to say, okay, I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to figure that out. So 8 years later, I start to think about, like, what does it mean to be an individual in an open community? What does it mean to be part of a community? And I know we are each part of different open communities, not just one, but many, right? It's about, you know, do we have a community kitchen in our neighborhood that we love and adore and go to and have pizza with or what have you? Do we actually have an open source project? Are we working on, of course, maybe you're working on OpenStreetMap, so thank you for that. But if you're not, maybe you're working on Java, maybe you're working on something else. This is really important to support. But as organizations, when you're thinking about open government, you're talking about a whole organization shift, a whole society shift. That's a lot of burden. And so here you are with allies trying to figure out how do you build open together. And so I'm going to reflect with some examples around what does it mean to be an individual in these communities. I'm going to give some examples from OpenStreetMap, but also from the Red Cross, Red Crescent, from my experiences there. So this is the individual, and I'm sorry it's a box, but what I wanted to show you, was that it's a map, right? We're a network map, and you hear this all the time, that communities are our network, and that's our value, and that we support that. But what's interesting about this is that it's not linear. And so sometimes we approach communities in a linear behavior. I will start out as, you know, a supporter, and therefore I will become a leader. And no, that's not people's lives. They do lots of different things in communities. And so communities are set up with this kind of linear plan. And frankly, most people are zigzaggers. And so how do we zigzag through communities and make it purposeful for them as individuals? So let's think about individuals, not the individuals like ourselves. I'm going to put you through 3 frameworks. And then after those frameworks, let's talk about how do we implement that. Okay, so this is the World Economic Forum. And so they created this framework to ask us to talk about digital. So you are potentially an online community, plus you have a local community, in-person community. So this tried and true lessons of organizing those community kitchens I was talking about, how do we digitize that? There's a lot of work to be said. And so for my friends who are data visualization folks, yes, it's a painful pie chart. It's hard to look at. But the key point is that every single day in your world, People are hearing news about security. They're hearing news about new tools, new software. They are trying to keep themselves safe, and they're trying to be engaged, and there's lots of noise. So how do you make that accessible for them? In the Norwegian Red Cross, they had this new program where they partnered young people with elderly people to help them use the internet to learn some basic digital skills. So while we're building these open communities, we also need a digital upgrade as a society. So if we're going to say, listen, we need to go from paper to digital, that upgrade means that maybe we need to partner young people with more senior people in the community or more digitized community people to be able to understand how they use things and how we make it as interactive and purposeful as possible. All the links, by the way, all the slides are going to be available. All the links, all the papers and everything and all the notes are in there for you, so you can go and look at it and please contradict. Okay? So here's another model. Okay, so that's one framework for how we digitize ourselves as communities. Okay? Here's another one. Now I'm a Mozilla kid, so pardon me. I like this, again, another pie chart. I like this because it says, how do we make it human-centered designed? Okay, so now you got your community. You're solving problems together. You're communicating. You're doing creative things. You're in this beautiful place, like top 10 places I've gotten to speak over my life. This is so pretty here. And then you get to collaborate. So that's what I hope we kind of co-create, right? So here we are. But this is underneath the fabric of how people use the internet. So when we're thinking about the communities that we're working on, how do we make that better in terms of how people use the internet? Okay, last framework, I promise. Okay, so when we think about designing communities, and I know more often than not, as organizers, we say, you know, it's organic, you know, people join, they believe altruistically that this is great, they believe in the mission. Remember, people are zigzaggers, right? They got 30 minutes. My sister, she said, Heather, I've got 30 minutes to help a cause. If there's drama or if it's too hard, I've got 2 kids, a mortgage, and a job, and I got 30 minutes to help you with your social activism thing, whatever topic of the day is. How do you fit into their 30 minutes? How does she use your community? So how can we take human-centered design approaches and participatory design to design our software, to design our structures, and our access points for communities? I like to think of it as T-shirt sizes, and I'll come to that. But Paolo was saying something about governance, or the person before was saying something about governance. So we need to think about each one of these attributes. So we go from this beautiful organic thing, which we need to love and adore, because without organic communities, there is no community, right? You can't retrofit that. You actually have to do the work. But the thing is that if you want to be networked, that's a lot of heavy lifting between that in terms of co-creation. So this is from the Community Roundtable. There's all kinds of kits and guides around community management. And so this tying together of how people use the internet, how we organize communities, best practices, these are things that communities can help each other with. So in my journey to try and understand communities, I made this terrible design, okay? I am not a software developer, I'm not a UX, but I'm a human being who thinks about how do people use your community? Small, medium, large, T-shirts. They use it T-shirts. I got 30 minutes, I got an hour, I'm gonna spend all weekend arguing with people on the internet. That's what I did last weekend, you're welcome. Because I'm psycho and I like to live over here, okay? So maybe I need to get a life. However, lots of people and how we build it on where do you want to go today? What's the adventure in your community? This is something you love, right? You believe in. So how we build that has to fit into people who use your community. So yes, we want them to do things, and yes, we have this mission, but unless we build it together and build a plan, kind of, as they say in the Wikipedia world, scaffolding, without that, not going to happen. So I went from individuals to some frameworks. Now, how do we get there? So as somebody who went from small volunteer organizations, which I still do in my spare time, to working for social entrepreneurs, to working for research, and then at a large organization, you heard Pablo, 191 national societies, 11.6 million volunteers around the world. That is massive. How do we bring that organization to be open? I'm like, that's a hard problem. I'm going to go spend some time there. cry a little bit, shake my head. As one of my colleagues tweeted back at me this week, scream in my pillow. So building open is hard, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're a government or whether you're building an open source project or you're building an organization, it's super hard. So finding your allies and learning best tactics. One of the things that I think open communities don't do enough of is share those best practices with each other. So there's a series of books. Yes, let's all drop things. Please don't. I might jump. I'm a little skittish. So this series of books is free online. It's from Red Hat. Okay, yes, Red Hat and IBM. We can talk about that later. But the series of books is around best practices and tactics about building nutritional value in open organizations. What's the heavy lifting we can do? What are some of the steps and lessons around it? They had books on open innovation, on open leadership, on open community. I wrote a chapter with my colleague Kate from OpenStreetMap on open community development and some of the hard things. So those best practices, that's something for you to look at. And so maybe, again, you're part of those open communities. So how can the lessons from your other open communities help this one that you care about and that you're here for today? Right? So I would encourage you to take a look at the books. Again, they're free to download. By all means, if you want to give them money, but otherwise, free. They sponsored something called the Open Ambassador. So across all the different open communities, they created something called the Open Principles. Now, so whatever flavor of open you are, and again, we're all kinds of communities. We're like a fabric of all different things. You know, they came up with these 5 principles. A good open community tries to be transparent. We try to be inclusive. We try to be inclusive. We try to be inclusive. They adapt. They collaborate. And they build community. So more often than not, a community is designed and organized to say, we're radically transparent. Congratulations, you failed over here, right? Sorry. But I mean, there's no test here. And every community has a practice to learn. But this is about being purposeful. Organic doesn't cut it when you actually have to deliver at a higher level. That's why open needs to work through this, right? When I say open, the different versions of it. So they wrote an article, one of the people, Ben Cotton, wrote an article this week about compassionate transparency. I was having a rough OpenStreetMap week last week. You can read it on the internet. A really rough week. I'm on the board, back, forth within the board, back, forth within the community. I read that article and I'm like, yes. Because reality is that we need to be compassionate and seek to understand and negotiate with each other. And so while we're building this thing that communities of passion are amazing. I mean, that is the engine that keeps it going, but it's the engine that burns it out too. So seeking to understand that middle ground is actually one of the hardest things to do in any relationship. But when you're talking about a global or a local, passionate, diverse neighborhood like yourselves, those are hard work. So underneath it, they have a bunch of definitions and some examples. People have written articles around it to try and give you some coaching. But I suspect that you can test yourselves on how you can be more open, but also teach the rest of the world, right? And so I think that's your mission, right? So if you're learning something about open government and open movements, what can we learn from you? And so while I work in humanitarian tech, I always keep my hat in other open communities because I'm desperate to find ways to transfer it. So again, I'm part of the OpenStreetMap community. Is anybody else part of the OpenStreetMap community? Have you used OpenStreetMap? Thank you. Thank you. So OpenStreetMap changed my life because it was this concrete, plausible, active thing that could be done with diverse communities around the world that meant an output, right? So that in my, working in technology for years, that really kind of, it's not just like something abstract, there's actually something super reachable from it. That community's over 10 years old. And we have some questions around how open we are in terms of our working groups, in terms of our governance, in terms of how we become global. How do we respect the individual communities, the individuals in the community who volunteer, the communities around the world, so OpenStreetMap in India and in Bangladesh and in Vietnam and OpenStreetMap in Panama. That's crazy town. Like, and believe me, some of those discussions are painful. But the thing about OpenStreetMap that I think is the most concerning for me is how we work on diversity. And we've had many discussions. I've spent, as I said, I spent the weekend arguing with people online. I mean, not arguing, but really suggesting that maybe we could find a middle ground. That maybe mansplaining with me is not going to work. And that maybe I might be a human being first and foremost. But trying to show your humanity online in a flat text doesn't work. I almost wanted to send them a video. Hi, my name's Heather. Let's have some coffee. Let's have a chat about how you're speaking to me right now. But that doesn't work. So we need to find a way to negotiate and find a common ground. So with OpenStreetMap, we're in a bit of a thing because a lot of our stuff, the community that's online is actually not necessarily reflective of the community that's in person, right? So how people interact online, we're going to have to worry about negotiating because we're missing that middle ground. And more often than not, it's he said, and then he said, and then he said, and he said. And then, don't get me wrong, the he's that are leading things, I really respect and honor them, even the people I completely disagree with, because I want them to feel like this is their community. And frankly, it is theirs too, but it's also ours. A bunch of us belong to something called Open Heroines. Now, Open Heroines is across all these open communities. And what we're trying to do is share tactics for inclusion, share tactics for diversity, encourage more women to be leaders in the governance of organizations. And it's terrifying because I think a lot of people think just because it's open application, oh, you can join a working group, that a woman's actually going to just say, yes, I'll join. When you're talking to me like that, like, no, I got 30 minutes. I got 30 minutes, and that I can watch drama on television, thank you. No. So how do you make it more accessible? So we're sharing some tactics with it. So if you are a woman in open of any kind, there's a whole community called Open Heroines out there that are trying to help each other be better leaders and also deal with the times where it's not going very well, which is sad, truly sad. So talked a little bit about OpenStreetMap. So what we've learned there is negotiation, trying to build trust. We have a lot of work to do, and I'm being very vulnerable and transparent in this because I think that if we as open communities can talk with each other about what we're learning, that's good. And so in OpenStreetMap, we're actually having big, heated discussions about how we govern ourselves, how we have a membership, what policies we need to change. And so we're not alone because every open community does that in some shape or form. So what can we learn from each other? How can we get better at that? We all need to take negotiation classes and maybe some humanity. So again, I'm a humanitarian. So I decided to join these open and tech things together. And that's a little bit strange and for some people because they're like open and protection, open in the most vulnerable people who've gone through crisis. What are you talking about, crazy lady? Well, I'm okay being crazy because I'm actually not the first person who said, the open principles and humanitarian principles got a lot in common. That was somebody from Sahana that wrote that. And so now I rob and steal it and quote it very often. Because if we actually think about humanity and how we make and humanize communities, there's something that humanitarians can teach open communities and vice versa. So how are we bringing open into a large institution? This is what I spend my day on. I work with a cadre of people in my organization in various national societies around the world, in the Secretariat in Geneva. We're all working on open data, open policies, human-centered design, open software, and it is tough because this is an organization that's very traditional. They're used to very traditional technical companies. We don't necessarily have the talking points for how do you negotiate with Microsoft, which we are actually. Microsoft has a huge open community, by the way, and it's actually gone very well. But at first, we didn't know how to talk with them as open people, right, as people who believe in open. And so we managed to get our talking points into the MOUs. We managed to get our talking points into events. And so that's exciting because large companies are now working with humanitarians on open things. Example, the Norwegian Red Cross is working on a health information management system, which gets used in emergency response units around the world, will get used. For example, in Bangladesh, we have ERUs, which are emergency hospitals, really, and for response. So the software that we could use could be open source. And so they've taken a big leap. So our health department, super strict, really focused on data protection, following international guidelines, really want to safeguard people, is working with Microsoft Norway, the local tech community in Norway, and IFRC around the world, and we're building an open source piece of software. It's one of the first big ones in our organization, and frankly, it takes a lot of super energy and a lot of conversations, a lot of coffee, and a lot of all-nighters from people who may no longer be in the Red Cross, Red Crescent, but they built that layer to be able to have that moment where we can actually do it. That's exciting for us. Oh, it's cut off again. Another way that we're building open in the Red Cross is missing maps. And so the missing maps, if you're familiar with it, it is Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, American Red Cross, British Red Cross, and Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. They started this, and they said, what if we created an open data set, an open map, to solve a humanitarian problem, and connected with universities, companies, general volunteers, schools, teachers, art students, you name it, and said, here's a problem. You can spend 30 minutes, 2 hours, all weekend mapping. You know what? Why don't you map for climate change in the Sahel region right now? What we need is a better base layer map so that when our responders go and deal with the migration issues there, that they actually know where the roads are. That's a real concrete problem. So it's a concrete problem. It's a clear ask. We've been very clear in terms of how we communicate it. We're very inclusive. We've had the Undersecretary General of our organization come and say, what are you guys doing? Can I join you? So what we've learned with missing maps is to always be charging. Maybe you'll get 5 people at your event. Maybe you'll get 400. But if you're consistent and you follow up and you keep your messaging going, and if you always try and teach people by learn by doing, how can we be open? This is why open data matters. Open data will help us be better humanitarians. Open data will help us be able to share data to be able to work with other humanitarians. So that's how we speak right now. So for 8 years, if you think about night and day, in 2010, we were all begging to be let into the room. Now they're hiring us. So it takes a long time for organizations to change. And I'm not saying it's a picnic because every day is a conversation. But the negotiation, the listening, and trying to understand what their needs are, why it matters, and how we can help them, that's really been our super focus. So that also involves trust, because again, we are talking about data, and so with OpenStreetMap, it's a base layer. It's buildings and roads and rivers, and not really any personal identifying information. But we do have to be careful because, for example, with ICRC, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross, we can't really map all the hospitals because it might be in a conflict zone, right? So we have to make decisions. So when we're building open, we build with protection first, right? So we take our humanitarian principles, those open principles, and we try and figure out where that middle ground is. And so that, to me, is how organizations win. But it does take a series of ambassadors inside the organization, but also outside. The more examples we can have from cities to influence humanitarian action, that's a good thing. Because the first responders are always going to be communities, right? So whatever emergency it is, it's always going to be the communities. So thinking through, what is that community center? And how do we get that kind of traditional community center where you're having coffee and your cooperative event or what have you. You know, it's a holiday season, so people are having cooperative events and potlucks. Everyone's bringing food. I don't know if potluck translates here, but it's a Northern Canadian thing, pardon me. But the idea of having that kind of communal activity, the digital community activities we haven't gotten very good at. I learned something really amazing in Qatar when I worked there. The women said they would be involved in these communities if they could call from home. They're allowed to be involved, but they need to do it from home because of their family values. So if we can find a way to digitize volunteerism to help people with different family situations, that's an exciting opportunity. It's a gap area. And again, remember I was talking about those, how do we reach those larger sectors? Because right now we're in the know. But that wider sector is how do we build communities and technology in a way that serves how people's days are. So my bank in Canada, when I call them, they say, How can I make your day better? I'm like, oh, I want to fight. Like, you blocked my credit card. I'm in, what the heck country was I in? But they blocked my credit card. I was like, why are you blocking my credit card? Well, you're in X country. I'm like, well, stop. But when they call and you say, how can I make my day better? I'm like, oh, man. Yes, you can make my day better. So it's a customer service approach to communities. So even though I wanted to argue with my bank, didn't have to. So how do we build communities and organizations with open principles? That requires us to think a little bit differently about that. So one other thing that we built at the Red Cross was the Data Playbook, and this has been something I've been working on. So I wanted to know how people use data. And everyone, when I joined, they said, hey, Heather, focus on big data. I'm like, whoa, 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 pause. I mean, I worked with data scientists. I think they're brilliant. I'm like, what kind of data do you have? How is it used part of decision making? What do you really want to do? So again, human-centered design approach, asking questions, listening, trying to figure out who those ambassadors are, helping those ambassadors with their problems, and then moving forward a couple of steps. So we created a data playbook based on what people thought they needed. So I asked around the world, what do you need? I said, what do you have in terms of training materials? And that was my gap analysis. So by co-creating something, I did a gap analysis to figure and a needs assessment on what people needed, and then built it with them. And so that, to me, is how you take open principles inside of an organization. I sent out spam emails to everybody and said, hi, we're going to have an event about data. What do you want to talk about? What do you mean? You're supposed to tell us. No. I asked them what you want to talk about. We did an unconference where I asked them what they wanted to learn. And they're like, what's an unconference? Okay. So let's work through that. How do we make it human-centered design learning? So instead of talking about, hey, open data matters, first of all, I asked them, what do they think about data? And then I threw in open data. I had the first 2 open data days in the Red Cross. People came. They're like, what is this open data thing? Oh, first you're going to tell us what data is. Thank you. Now we're OK with that. So we basically took them on a progression. So when we're talking about the ways to reach participatory work, first we need to meet them where they are, right? And so what I found was people were interested in open data, but what they really wanted to know was, what does it mean to them and how do they fit it into their day? How can I make their day better? Make their day better, then they'll talk about open data. Talk about open data and tell them they have to do it this way, they're gone, right? And so that's a negotiation. That's an understanding where people are. But what I found really fun about this is that once we made an informal data working group, and I asked around, I'm like, who can train this? Because I can't hire anybody. Who's got the skills? The same thing that we do in all open communities. Hey, listen, can you run the front door because I can't pay somebody? I've run the front door so many times. Hey, you know what, can you answer emails on the weekend because I want to have an American holiday? That's what I did last weekend so that my American colleagues could have a holiday, right? So we need to find ways to chip in to support open in hard ways. And so what I did is I found ambassadors. And those ambassadors themselves are now part of a formal working group on data where open is default, something that we talk about. So it's taken us, not just me, but a bunch of people in-house saying, okay, how do we shepherd the conversation towards open? We've got to start where they are and then build that scaffolding and the activities, and always building activities. So I made small activities for 30 minutes. I made activities which you could create something, activities where people came and talked about their software, activities where people, showed videos, anything. Anything to keep it going and keep the conversation going. And then I sent talking points to the leaders. So how many of you have written talking points for people on open? The more talking points we write and the more examples we find, the better we're going to get at this. And so basically, this playbook is free online. It's Creative Commons. I actually begged for it to be Creative Commons license. And I actually was able to find some internal actors who said, yes, it should be Creative Commons. And I went around legal, around comms, and said, hi, my colleagues want it open. I'm just going to make it open. And they're like, OK, see ya. It's like, how is this not a fight? Because I heard that it used to be a fight. No, great, great. So now it's open. And so what we want to do is build a data literacy consortium. So we, as humanitarians, we're solving this problem for ourselves. It's our scenarios, it's our examples, it's our exercises. And so scenario-based learning, people learn by things they know. And so we've made a scenario around cash transfer because when there's an emergency, we're trying to give cash to communities rather than send buckets from one other community. Honestly, shouldn't they buy locally? That to me seems like pretty logical. So we've built out scenarios from what people know to try and teach the things. And we let people write the scenarios for us so that we can use that as a teaching engine. So these things, you can see that we built things that are accessible by what people know and what they use, right? So not everybody learns information the same way. Not everybody wants to listen to a talk. Not everybody wants to build something. And so you have to think about your community in terms of where do they want to go and what activities they want to do. And so that's how we've approached data literacy at IFRC. And that's how we've approached trying to build open community in-house. And I think with this data playbook, we can white label it. And that's my biggest goal with the consortium, is to white label it. Because the lessons we've learned is that when I published it, all of a sudden, different NGOs who are not humanitarians and people in the open community said to me, hey, can we have that? I'm like, yes, but I'm going to focus on humanitarians. So please, fork the code. It's PDF and Word right now, because that's what works in some of our branches. We don't have internet everywhere in the Red Cross. And that's something that is a reality. We can talk about open all we want, but if we don't actually have internet, that's going to be an issue. Okay? So we have to figure out how to put things in flash drives and put things online. And that's the reach that we have. So we have to build for all these different audiences. We also have to build for the two audiences that, two or three audiences that I think when we did our user-centered design that I think might be helpful. We found out that we had this data curious, the people who wanted to know, what is this data thing? They're like, I hear it in the news. I heard about that nasty Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing. Now I understand data protection. What do I do? How do I understand this? Then there's the data advocates, the data ready. We have these people, but we also have the data deniers. And I love the data deniers. I'm so excited when they tell me, no, data doesn't matter, open data doesn't matter, because that's an opening. Right? That's okay. Now we have to have a conversation. So when you think about your users in your community, your profiles, who are your communities and who are the people who are not in the room? Where are your gaps? And how are you going to build scaffolding to have everybody else join? And so when you're thinking about your community and when you're hoping for it, so I've talked about individuals, I've talked about communities, and then I talked about trying to build open in our community that I work, my organization. Like, this is heavy lifting, and it's a lot of work, and I think the best thing that happened is that I was able to learn from other open communities. And that, to me, is a saving grace and sanity in the screaming in the pillow that you have to often do. But, transparency itself is not an end game, okay? And when I was talking about those user profiles of how people use your community and how do we make it valuable for them, that's super hard. But when they join the community, what happens when you get into an argument? More often than not, we haven't set ourselves up to negotiate change or to be sustainable. And that, to me, is why open communities fail. And I hope that as we go through and we work as people who, I've done 8 years in this kind of open community, but as we go forward with more open communities, we should all be learning from each other, and I look forward to learning from you. So when we say open, that's all of our responsibility. Thank you. I told her I'd time myself. Is there water? I need headphones, my friend.
Tenemos ahora un turno de preguntas que no sé cuánto nos queda, como unos 10 minutos. Y estamos tomando preguntas tanto de las personas que estáis aquí en la sala como por Twitter o Telegram. También se puede hacer con el hashtag y por el canal del Metadecidim, aunque que se lo digan las personas presenciales igual no tiene demasiado sentido. Y no sé si hay preguntas dentro del público. Otra opción. Okay, so I do have many questions from your presentation.
Yep.
One of the things that I really...
Welcome to the Pablo and Heather show.
Yeah. Actually, one of the first questions that came to my mind is when you were presenting the composition of the Missing Maps project and community. What you said, it was built from institutions, academia, activists. So at some point I see some similar composition as the Metadecidim community. And what you said, like, it worked quite well because you were able to identify concrete problems. Which I find that this is quite a challenge. And in our context that we are talking about democracy and participatory democracy, but also radical democracy, there are so many understandings on which are the existing problems to that. So I was wondering, like, from your experience, and that's the end of the question, which are the best practices or best techniques for the community to identify the challenge to be addressed?
Right. So everybody has different lists of definitions. And so when I said open, what I didn't ask you is, what's your definition of open? Okay. And how do you implement open? Right? So I gave you some examples of how we implemented open with concrete problems. That took a long, long conversation around what really matters, and a lot of negotiation and a lot of consolidation. So when it comes to your work, I really think something that I've seen happen in hackathon communities, which is, hackathons by their very nature need to get more sustainable, which is what we've done with this project I was talking about, the health information system. So it's about putting all your problems on the board and saying, what's your top problem that you want to solve, and voting up. It used to be called Dotmocracy, where you can vote up what your top problem you think is, and then you do a design jam around that. And then from the design jam, you work on, like, how do you illustrate and how do you project manage it out. And so if I was to say your starting point is really about, like, what are your definitions? What do you want to work on? Prioritization of it. But also spend the time to really seek to understand what are your power mechanisms, what are the personalities involved, what are the barriers, what are the opportunities. It's almost like you have to do a risk matrix on it. But there's nothing, like, most of the stuff in the Data Playbook, what we've done is we put it on the wall. So I have something called the data simulation. And with the data simulation, we put all the kind of steps of a data process on the wall. So let's say it's a policy process. Let's just convert this, okay? Put all the steps on the wall, and then we gave different colored sticky notes for what roles, what questions, what risks, and we started to do the analysis of that, and that's how we were able to change some of the policies. So write down what you think your standard operating procedures are for your policies or your plans, figure out what your problems are, and then try and vote through. But that's only going to come with a lot of negotiation, and maybe you might want to have people divide themselves up. So start somewhere. So with the Data Playbook and the Data Literacy Program, I asked everybody, every room I went into, I'm like, hi, what's the top data question you have? What do you want to learn? And so after about 8 or 9 rooms, the top thing was data analysis, data basics, and how do I use Microsoft Excel. Those are the top 3 things people wanted to do. I'm like, okay, those are nice and fluffy. What do I do with those, right? So, I mean, and that's the thing, right? So when you have something not concrete, you have to try and say, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And then negotiate. But there's lots of great tools online to do this, but it's just a matter of, like, first giving people a napkin sketch of what you think it is and then having them kind of pick it apart. It's almost like you need to write that sketch with a couple of small group and do, like, a sprint on it and then push it out. But only you can figure out what works for your community. Like, who am I? I'm from Northern Canada. I live in Switzerland. Like, I don't know Catalonia, I don't know this neighborhood. Like, I know a little bit about it, but only you can decide what your mechanisms are.
I don't know if there are more questions in the audience.
Okay. Yeah. Hello. What is your name?
Oh, micro.
Oh, we have to get you a mic. It's okay. It'd be awesome if you told me your name and...
Sí, una pregunta, perdón. Una organización abierta, ¿cómo crees que debe ser la toma de decisiones? ¿Cómo debería ser la toma de decisiones?
It's dead. I think it's dead. Yes. Hi. Thank you.
Sí, en una organización abierta con una comunidad plural, diversa, inclusiva, ¿cómo debería ser la toma de decisiones de esa comunidad, de esa organización, ¿no? Cómo hacer que la, ¿cómo se ríe?
Okay.
Que la toma de decisiones sea también operativa y pueda ejecutarse, pueda ser ágil y a la vez democrática, diversa, inclusiva.
Yeah. Okay, so part one, how do you want the decision-making process to work? You got a wall. No, seriously. Think about it. You got a wall. You got some sticky notes. How do you want it to look? Right, that's one. Two, so in terms of open governance, I have a Google Doc with all kinds of resources on governance and governance models for open communities, because when I was on the humanitarian OpenStreetMap board, we had a governance crisis. And so I went and looked at as many open communities in terms of conflict analysis and how they're set up and what's the priorities and how they vote. And so there's a whole list of things there. And so I encourage everyone to look at how other examples, and again, look into how other examples work. Now, when it comes to decision-making, I've kind of flipped the table a little bit. So I think we need to work on governance. We also need to understand the power in the room, right? There's always the one person, Devin, who always has a comment. He's quiet today. But like a comment, right? And there's always that one person who talks a lot, right? So how do you make it possible for other people who are more introvert? So I'm half and half, right? Like I'm going to be so quiet this weekend. This is a lot of energy for me. So how do you make it safe for the people who have something thoughtful to say but need that time to process or need that effort to kind of do that, who maybe not the loudest person in the room but have a different version? So everybody has to have the power. Okay. So in the playbook, we've done something about decision-making because we want to have a fair discussion about, are we actually talking about decision-making? Okay? Because I think there's some preamble. Much like before you talk about open data, you need to talk about data. First, you need to talk about what is leadership, what are decisions, and what are your community norms and values. Figure that out before you get to decision-making. If you've already done that, perfect, right? So we did this exercise with humanitarians because we were interested in how they use information products or how they use data for decision-making. So we put a bunch of humanitarians in the front, leaders, people who are decision makers, and then a bunch of nerds, my lovely nerds, right? Like the people who create information products and visualizations and graphs and charts and and look at the data. Put them in the same room. We said, what's your priority? How do you want to receive information? What's your priority? How do you like to deliver it? And what we found is, like, we made a list of, there's a whole checklist there of, like, how people want to perceive information, how they make decisions on it, what kind of information do they need to make decisions. And so make a checklist of what is a decision, right? And have role-playing around decision-making. So that's the thing I did in Bangkok a couple of weeks ago. We took it and flipped it. So we put a bunch of people who create these information products and then some other people who did it, and we said, listen, you're the decision maker. Let them try and figure out what you want from them. Put them in the hard spot. So you can be the decision maker, since you're smiling, okay? So he's the decision maker, so you have to negotiate with him on what you want to do. So by role-playing, you learn the tactics, right? But you also write down where you're gapping out, right? Or where the fails are. That, to me, seems like a way to kind of go forward. And again, it's learn by doing, right? So figuring out what you want to change and then figuring out what how you're going to do that. But the thing I just showed you was that it's training each other to have that negotiation. Because I find that sometimes when we're talking to leaders, we don't think that we're our own leader too, right? Everybody in this room is a leader in their own right. You just lead differently, right? And we're never really told that, right? We're all decision makers. We make decisions every day. Do I take the train? Do I bike? You know, do I get married? Do I get divorced? Like, I mean, we make decisions. So how do we figure out how to make better decisions as communities? That means having some really hard conversations. So your wall, your sticky notes, that's just a thought. Thanks. I'm happy to talk more. There's no cold notes. There's no secret passion. There's no secret sauce. We're all trying to figure it out. So you teach me.
Vale. No sé si tenemos más preguntas. Aquí.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, hello. I'm Andres, also from the Decidim team.
Hi, Andres.
It's maybe a tangential question. What ideas do you have about improving empathy on social discussion and deliberation? Just an easy question.
Yeah, no. So I when it comes to trying to be empathetic in open source communities, I decide to, I push a little bit differently in the fact that I'm radically open with my feelings about how they made me feel, which is not necessarily something that everyone's going to do on the internet. I'm like, hi, you called my argument nonsense. That didn't make me feel very well. That was Sunday. But I try to call them on it in terms of how I want to be treated. That's the first part. Now, for fun, there's a Canadian company called 21 Toys, and they have this thing called the empathy game. I'm not kidding. It is like bricks and blindfolds. That's a lot of trust. But I mean, there's lots of team building things you can do. And Atlassian, if you're familiar with Atlassian, they have a thing called the Team Playbook. And so the Data Playbook that I created was because I love this idea of team building and learning best tactics. So they have what they call a bunch of plays and exercises in terms of trying to build empathy in communities. Most people in communities, they start with a code of conduct. Okay, and so we've had the big old meltdown in OpenStreetMap about the code of conduct. And in humanitarian OpenStreetMap, we have a code of conduct. But in the larger OpenStreetMap community, we do not, because we can't agree as to what the community norms are, because we're so diverse. That's one. And so we have an etiquette guideline, right? So teaching empathy, I don't mean to position it, but not everybody naturally enjoys empathy. Not everybody has that personality skill. The internet does not translate that. So teaching empathy is a thing. Encouraging empathy is a thing. Encouraging humanity is a thing. But there are some tactics online for that. I also like the code for nonviolent communication. And I know that sounds crazy, but I actually took the humanitarian principles of nonviolent communication and threw it onto the OpenStreetMap community wiki because I felt like those tried and true lessons for how you negotiate hard conversations, it translates. So sometimes I don't have empathy for being mansplained, but I try. I try so hard. You didn't mansplain me, but I'm just trying to make a joke. I'm terrible at jokes. You can call me on that. Buy me coffee. Tell me.
Thank you for your presentation. We have commented several times about we are building a community from 2 years. The last 2 years, we are building this community around Decidim project.
Right.
Decidim is a platform to articulate democratic governance in institutions, but also in organizations. And in this sense, we have the tools to create this kind of democratic governance and create communities around around our project. Actually, we are using our own tool to govern the Decidim process. And just to ask two questions. The first one is if you think that Decidim can have a place in the world of organizations and at international level to think and to design and to create democratic governance inside these organizations. We have initial experiences here in Spain, very successful. And the second question is, which would be your main advice to our community in the process and in the constitution of the community here in Barcelona?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to answer your second question. People before data. Tools. So it doesn't matter what shiny thing you're building, and I'm sure it's shiny. I don't know it very well, pardon me, but I love software, truly. I used to work in libraries. I actually went to library school, and I was like, oh, this internet thing, much more interesting. I love my dusty books, don't get me wrong, but yeah, technology is at the heart of everything, but unless it's human-centered design, unless it's the people before the tools, you're never going to get there. I'm super impressed, and I used to work for organizations around the world. And I'm super impressed with the thing that, this idea around if you build it, they'll come. Again, that community center, have you had coffee with them, right? And so what's your offline and online plan, right? How do you push people to the platform? Is it useful? Do women use it the same as men? Non-binary genders, do they use it the same, right? That's one. Two, how are you going to reach that wider circle? Okay. I still feel like the cities themselves, like there's a lot that humanitarians and cities can learn from each other, right? Like we're all trying to deal in certain boundaries and certain topics, but OpenStreetMap by ourselves, we use Lumio for decision making, okay? So at the board of OpenStreetMap Foundation, we use Lumio. So are you familiar with Lumio, everyone? Yeah? Okay. So like any piece of software, compare your software, okay? What's in it for them? How is it different? I've seen so many Kobo, ODK, Magpie. These are data collection tools. Comparison between what's the value, what's the tool, what's the offering. And I hate to business model canvas you in terms of startups, but what is the offering and how is it different? Being creative in your approach, right? The impact stories, like with any piece of software, what's the impact of it, right? Are you reaching people? What's in it for them? It's not just about the demo, it's about their community around the software that makes it powerful. So Lumio, right, and Liquid Democracy by its very nature, they created a community by a great story, right? And they've inspired lots of people in the open community. So yes, if you want to expand, that's fantastic. But first, work on your roots here, right? So have the two-pronged plan, perhaps. Like, so if your intention is to grow what you're doing, making sure that you actually foster the community you have here in the ways that you can grow it offline and online, and then focus on reaching the other communities. Because if you do both too much at once, you might fracture yourself. Lots of communities grow too fast, or software grows too fast, and then they sprain, right? And so I don't know. Like, I think it really depends on what your strategic plans are and how your community governs yourself, as my friend who asked decision-making questions, right? So what does this community want to do? Do they want to expand to other cities? Because if it's 5 people deciding you want to expand to other cities, but your city isn't agreed to that, that's a thing, right? I don't know. Hard.
We're going to explain together.
Yeah, no, I'm here for the download. No, because I think, and so in talking with Pablo and Taipei, I really feel like we need, as open communities, a new way to deal with some of our transactions. I've told you some difficult things that we've had. Right now in OpenStreetMap, we're mailing list arguing, and we're making decisions based on voting and membership. And so there's some things, there's some processes, there's some try-to-cheat things, but governance can change anywhere, right? And so if somebody has a good plan, it can make a good argument and show good process and how to make my day better, great, right?